Okay, part 2 of the Kingdom of Kubala. I don't even know what to call this, to be honest. Okay, and thank you for your patience. Thank you for bearing with me. Some of you were patient. Some of you were messaging me and all sorts. But like, I'm humble rest of you. Okay, I have to work. I'm doing my best. So I believe it's fairly early on in the marriage that Nino, floats the idea of being a polygamist to Jean. And Jean on her blog says that this wasn't news to her. She was familiar with polygamy. I believe her dad, who is quite a pivotal figure in her life, and we will come back to him later on. I believe he had multiple wives, so it wasn't something that she was unfamiliar with. She was, in theory, okay with the concept. In practice, though, it seemed like Jean actually really struggled with sharing Nino in the early stages. A lot of the blog posts, so I will say her blog is still up. However, she has done a lot of editing. She has done a lot of censoring. She's deleted a lot of the blog posts that documented the Shulamite and the Hagar era. But it's okay. I remember. The wives were always fighting. There was always a lot of cattiness, a lot of bitterness, a lot of bitchiness about how long he was spending with who. He would pretend to go to bed with Jean in the night, and then he would wake up at like 2 a.m. and then go and sneak out and stay in Shulamite's room. And then when they brought Hagar on the scene, Hagar was like a whole different kettle of fish, because she, while Shulamite was Ghanaian, Hagar was described as being Asian. And for like any Americans that are watching, in the UK, Asian, the term Asian is usually used to describe somebody of South Asian descent. So she was of South Asian descent, and she was also painted out to have quite a good job. I believe she worked in finance, and Shulamite also had a good job. He actually met Shulamite in university, and then encountered her, invited her to an event in the UK years later, and reconnected in that way, and then, made a move on her, proposed to her, took her home and said, "You're going to be my second wife." And then he pretty much did the same thing with Hagar. So that trio of wives fell apart, and Hagar was demoted to a concubine because she brought an engagement ring and proposed to Nino in one of the serviced apartments, which was apparently a big no-no. Like, he is the one to make the move on the woman like that. He is the one to let them know when they are going to, be stepping into their next role, because there's a hierarchy in the household. So yeah, it goes Nino, Jean as the first wife, second wife, and then the concubine, or whoever that is below the second wife. The concubine, from Jean's writing, she makes it seem like they're just there for physical pleasure, whereas the wives will be the ones that bear the children and the heirs of Kubala, or the Northern Kingdom. So Jean as a mother, I would say that Jean was a good mom. Mind you, when she met Nino, she had 6 children. They did have another baby together. So it was initially 7 children that they had. Blended that family, he accepted them all, and they were just one big family. They were one big happy family. From what you could see online, Jean was a good mom. She enjoyed parenting. She enjoyed having as many children as she did. So then Shulamite gets pregnant. So Jean really gets jealous here, because up until this point, she is the one that bears the children, and she sort of has that title. And now by Shulamite getting pregnant, it sort of shuffles things up in the household. Again, there are a lot of posts about crying wives, about like cattiness. I believe that Shulamite shaved off Jean's eyebrows at one point, I'm not sure. A lot of like cattiness over cooking food, taking care of the children. And Shulamite begins to, post her own blog. She begins to document her story of Nino in her own words. Again, I will leave it up here so you guys can go and read it. The thing that I find most disturbing about Shulamite is the fact that she disappears. She disappears. The last we hear of her, she is pregnant. Hagar, the third wife / concubine, has been exiled, and that's all we hear. That's the last that we hear of Shulamite, which I think is concerning. I hope and I pray that, you know, she just left, she caught some sense, and she's raising her child somewhere in peace. So there was a period where it was like fairly uneventful, right? There was no Shulamite, there was no Hagar. I believe Jean was pregnant, so a lot of her blogs were about taking care of her children, which again, I believe she was a good mum. However, during this uneventful time is when we see the birth, I suppose, of the House of Ophir, which then later on becomes the Northern Kingdom, which later on becomes Kubala, okay? And that's where, during that moment of that sort of era of peace and quiet, is when he sort of brings forth this House of Ophir, and they begin, in their blog post, she starts to talk about maybe like some type of, how can I say this? I wouldn't say rituals, but actually, yeah, some of them were rituals, like, and I feel like that's what she says, that's what she calls them as well. A lot of ceremonies and dinners and feasts to bring in this new era of the House of Ophir.